Hello, everyone. Please take your seats. Come on down. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Eddy, and I'm the Executive Director for Womentum, and I am very happy to have you here tonight. I see a whole lot of really crowded seats way in the back, and we had reserved, and a lot of the sponsors are back there. If anyone wants to come up to these seats in the front, please do. No pressure, but if you would like to move forward, we'd love to have you come forward. This is a really exciting evening. This is a culmination of about 9 months worth of planning and organization, and thank you for being here with me tonight to celebrate this. The 2022 Womentum Leadership Summit is called Got Moxie, Developing Strength, Courage, and Resilience. And that title came together when I first spoke to Lindsay Moran, our keynote tonight, as she began to tell her story. And then as all the pieces of this summit came together, it really made sense, strength, courage, and resilience in these times that we've been in. But we were looking for something that had a little bit more of an upbeat nature. I think we're all getting a little exhausted by the term resilience on its own. And that's where Moxie came in. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. Before we get started, I just want to thank the National Museum of Wildlife Art for this beautiful venue. And Hughes Productions, who's making the live stream possible for those who are watching remotely. Welcome. We're delighted that you're here in your own way. For those of you who are not familiar with Womentum, we are a locally based nonprofit organization. Our mission is to empower and connect women as leaders within their communities. And we do that through this annual summit. We also have a speaker series and other educational programs, and then we have our signature 9-month mentoring program. And I'm very proud to say that we have a huge number of alums who are here tonight. If you could raise your hand and let us know if you've been part of Womentum, you'll know that there are a lot of extraordinary women in this room, and we also want to welcome the brave men who have joined us, and we hope that you bring your friends next year. I also want to recognize our event sponsors. There's so many of you here tonight, and we are so grateful for your support, not only in helping to make this event possible, but also in advocating for your female employees and colleagues and friends and loved ones to be a part of Womentum. We are so proud to be such a large community of women making a difference here in Jackson Hole and beyond. Our board members, many of them are here tonight, and I just would love for them to stand up and take some recognition. And we have a number of volunteers as well who are helping, and we're so grateful to their help. This is a combined effort of a tremendous group of women that I am so happy to be a part of. Okay, so let's talk about Moxie, energy, determination, know-how. That's what Webster's dictionary calls Moxie. And once again, going to that name, there's a common denominator for all of our Leadership Summit speakers. Each one of them has turned hardship into triumph. And I don't think that anyone can tell that story as significantly as a kickoff program as our keynote tonight, Lindsay Moran. Lindsay is a former CIA operative with 20+ years across a broad professional spectrum that includes investigation, covert operations, analysis, and communications. She is also part of the team at Deliver Fund, a nonprofit intelligence organization that leverages cutting-edge technology in its mission to eradicate and end human trafficking. Lindsay is the author of the best-selling memoir, Blowing My Cover, and her articles and opinions have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, the Huffington Post, and other various publications. She's also served as a commentator on national security and intelligence issues for many major media outlets. Lindsay is a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia University. I found out tonight that she was the commencement speaker at Harvard and spoke to 27,000 people. So this is nothing for her. And she serves on the board of the India Water Project, a nonprofit committed to easing the burden of women and girls throughout the underserved communities of India by providing clean, safe, accessible, and environmentally sound sources of water. Since her arrival in Jackson Hole yesterday, Lindsay has expressed how much she loves Wyoming. She not only spent a summer working in Yellowstone when she was young, but also her CIA alias was from Lander. But she can tell you more about that. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Lindsay Moran to the stage. We're back in the saddle, making adversity work for you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Sam. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. I don't know if you can tell how much I'm smiling. I want to start off by saying that I am a perimenopausal woman and the mother of 2 teenage boys. So the fact that even one person would be interested in a single thing I have to say, let alone a group of people willing to listen to me for 45 minutes, it's just beyond. I'm super excited about that. And I also feel like I can tell you guys, or you women, because it's a mainly female audience, that I was majorly stressed about what I was going to wear for this event. And I told a colleague of mine, a man who's from the West, that I was going to speak to this women's group in Jackson Hole, and he said, well, you have to dress like Beth Dutton on Yellowstone. And I had never watched Yellowstone, and I didn't have time between when this conversation took place and now to binge watch Yellowstone. But I did Google Beth Dutton, and the first picture that came up is this gorgeous woman squatting like in a field of sagebrush or something, and she has on this spectacular fringe suede full-length jacket and a cowboy hat, and I was just like, oh my God. I mean, I do have clothes like that. I do have some clothes like that, but I moved over the summer and everything's in boxes, and I didn't have it I couldn't get it together to channel my inner Beth Dutton. So here I am in basic East Coast black. I tried to spice it up a little with this choker collar, because before this, it was just black pants and a black shirt. And I have to say, like, short of having a green apron, I looked like a Starbucks barista. And I can say that because my 17-year-old son is a Starbucks barista, and so I know what the uniform is. It's black shirt, black pants, and a green apron. So, and another funny thing about my son, the barista, he knows everything I've done, or most of what I've done, but he at least knows that I worked for the CIA. And it was funny because he's been a Starbucks barista for it must be 3 years now. And he said to me one day, he said, "Mom, you couldn't deal with the stress of my job." And you know what? He's 100% right. Because I have seen suburban soccer moms when they don't get their double decaf, non-fat, no foam, soy pumpkin latte, and they are scary. They are worse than terrorists, yes. So he's 100% right. Anyway, that's all a preamble to say I'm so happy to be here, and yeah, let's get on with it. That is not me, but I love that photograph, and So, earlier this year, I was asked to speak on a podcast about overcoming adversity. The podcast was hosted by a man named Marcus Aurelius Anderson, and he's author of the book, The Gift of Adversity, Overcoming Paralysis and Pain to Find Purpose. Some years ago, while preparing to deploy with the US Army, Marcus had suffered a severe spinal injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. The surgeons who saved his life told him he'd never walk or use his arms again. And after months of suicidal depression and anger, Marcus began looking for a lesson to be learned from his injury. And he started trying to see his adversity as a gift. I'm not going to tell you what happened with Marcus Aurelius Anderson, but I will tell you that when he asked me to come on his podcast to speak about my career as a CIA operative, turned author, turned speaker, turned consultant, turned social justice advocate, I told him very sincerely that I didn't feel I was the right fit for the theme of his podcast. Truth be told, I have not really experienced, or I had not really experienced any adversity in my life. Sure, I'd had some challenges and some setbacks and a few hurdles to overcome, but nothing that amounted in my mind to real adversity. So I suggested some other women I knew who I thought would be good guests for Marcus to have on his show. But he persisted, and he convinced me that I would have something to contribute to the conversation and to his listeners, especially based on my experience early in my career as an undercover operative in the, at that time, inarguably male-dominated and historically sexist good old boys world of the CIA. So I said, okay. So the day before the podcast that we were going to record, I had a typically packed day. I planned to meet a high school friend in town for lunch, and then I had to be home to get my younger son to swim team practice. Since I also had work to do for a client and I wouldn't have time to work out, I decided to ride my bike. And by bike, I mean a bicycle, not a Harley. I'm not that reckless or brave. The 9 miles from my home to Annapolis. With my laptop in a backpack, I would get some work done at a cafe, I would meet my friend for lunch, and then I would head home in time to get Shep, my younger son, to swim team. No matter that the forecast called for a severe thunderstorm, the chances were only 60%. I would beat those odds. I would beat that storm. After lunch, which went slightly longer than expected, I threw my backpack over my shoulder and I hopped on my bike. The sky was dark. Heavy clouds loomed overhead. I strapped my helmet on and hit the road. About a quarter of a mile onto the Baltimore-Annapolis Trail, and the rain started to fall. It was light, but you could tell it would be coming down soon. The sensible thing for me to do would have been to pull off the trail, lock my bike, and call an Uber, or call a friend, or even call my older son, who has his driver's license, and he could have come and picked me up. But I didn't want to do that. It's not my nature to ask for help, and it's not my nature to admit defeat. Some, like my mother, might even say it's not my nature to do the sensible thing. So instead of doing the sensible thing, I decided to pedal more furiously. As I said, I would beat the storm. Well, spoiler, I did not beat the storm beat me, and so did the pavement. As I was going down an ever so slight incline around an ever so slight turn, I felt the front tire turning and slipping of its own accord. I felt the bike giving way, and I felt myself, in fact, I saw myself going down, head over handlebars. And I mean, I felt like my brain left my body and watched as I went down. And as it was happening, I knew that it was going to be bad. I hit the pavement of the trail, and for several moments, I'm not sure how long, I could not move. I just lay there, my face in the dirt, crying or moaning or something. At some point, I started speaking out loud to myself. By this time, the rain was really coming down. I confirmed that I could move, and I got to my knees, and then I managed to stand up, and the bike was intact somehow. So I got back on, and I started to ride home. I was crying audibly at this point and repeating to myself like a mantra, "You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay." And it was almost like if I kept repeating that to myself, I would make it come true. Since there was a full-on derecho at this point, the trail was expectedly empty. And to this day, I cannot remember if he was on foot or a bike, but a man appeared like an apparition coming from the other direction. And when he saw and heard me, and I really must have appeared and sounded deranged because I was crying and talking out loud to myself, he asked me if I was okay. For some reason, to this day I cannot explain why, I said that I was, and I carried on. 7 miles until I was almost home. About a quarter of a mile out, the bike chain broke. And a little girl who was sitting on her porch in a house where I had more than once seen an eviction notice saw me struggling up the hill, pushing my bike, and she came up to ask me if I was okay. And this time I answered honestly, no, I am not. And she went in to get her mom. I'm going to cut a little bit to the chase now and tell you some hours later at the Baltimore-Washington Hospital Center, a CAT scan revealed that I had fractured my C1 vertebra in 2 places, which for those of you who don't know, and I did not know this at the time, it's the last vertebra before your skull. Google searches, which are always a good idea, revealed that common complications of C1 fractures range from minor discomfort to permanent paralysis to death. At the ER, I heard for the first time what I would hear again and again from medical professionals for many days that turned into weeks, that turned into months. You are extremely lucky to be alive and also not to be paralyzed. I'm going to pull up a picture now. That's me. I think that was the day after I broke my neck. And those are my tires. I don't know if I mentioned, but they were like racing slicks. Yeah, I'm getting rid of those. The C1 was one of the 2 vertebrae that the late great actor and accomplished horseman Christopher Reeve broke, irreparably injuring his spinal cord after a fall from a horse in 1995. That accident rendered Reeve a quadriplegic who used a wheelchair and a ventilator for the rest of his life. But it also ushered, in my opinion, perhaps the most meaningful and impactful period of Reeve's life. Not only did he return to creative work and acting, he wrote 2 books. He continued work he'd begun in the 1980s as an activist for environmental and human rights causes, and he also began lobbying for spinal injury research and for better insurance coverage for people with disabilities. He and his wife established the Christopher Reeve Foundation, and they co-founded the Reeve Irvine Research Center. I'm going to show a picture of one of my life's heroes. So much good came from the misfortune and adversity that befell this one man. So I am no Christopher Reeve, that's for sure, but I am a silver lining girl, and I will find the silver lining in every and any calamity. And when I broke my neck and lived and walked to tell the tale, as I am today, well, the most immediate silver lining was I had something to talk about on that damn podcast about adversity. I was in way too much pain and, frankly, still a bit of shock to record the podcast with Marcus Anderson the day after I broke my neck, but I had a damn good excuse to postpone. And I was already fast-tracked psychologically, looking at my first real rodeo with adversity as something that might be kind of positive. In my youth, I too had been a horsewoman, and I grew up with a mad crush on Superman, incidentally. That did not diminish even when he could no longer fly, ride, or even walk. And as soon as I understood what could have been the severity of my injury, I understood how lucky I was, and that maybe this was a blessing rather than a curse. And when I say a blessing, I mean a real blessing, a gift given to me by God. And by God, I mean my personal interpretation of God, which is not an old, bearded white man in the sky with fat baby angels flying around his head. My God manifests herself in the wonders of nature and in the miracles of healing and in the rare perpetuation of peace and in forgiveness and in empathy and above all in resilience. And my God, let me make this clear, is a woman. Okay, I got kind of real heavy real quick there. But I'm going to take us all back a step and tell you how, after growing up in the 1980s, under the specter of the Cold War and potentially impending nuclear war, the product of an ice storm family, and my parents' acrimonious War of the Roses without the humorous undertones style divorce, a career that started with operating undercover for the CIA in the war-torn Balkans, 2 teenage boys, my own divorce, a bout of depressive disorder, and some other crapola. Breaking my neck at the age of 52 was truly my first rodeo with real adversity. When I was a little girl, I'm going to go to our next picture here, maybe around the age of 10 or 11, I got a little obsessed with a character from a book, Harriet the Spy. There's Harriet, and I think that's the original book cover. Harriet was a bit of a smartass, and she was a bit of a subversive, and, well, she was a spy, and I thought that was really cool. And so I began to fashion my life around Harriet the Spy, and I got myself a notebook and a pen, and I just kind of skulked around and spied on people. At the age of 10, there were not a lot of interesting folks for me to spy on. There was my parents, my brother, the neighbors, the McCormicks. Spent a lot of time spying on them. They never did anything. But anyway, I persisted, and I decided that when I grew up, I would be a real spy. I would work for the Central Intelligence Agency. So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and my father did top secret work designing ships for the U.S. Navy. But as a little girl, I didn't really understand what he did. I just knew that we weren't allowed to go to his work or his office, and when I called his office, someone would answer, and they would say, "This is a non-secure line." And when I traveled with him, we were always on the lookout for agents from the Eastern Bloc. My father would pack his suitcase in this particular persnickety way to make sure it had not been tampered with, and we'd be looking for surveillance. And at the same time, I looked at my grandfather, his father, and I noted that during his career, spent almost entirely overseas, allegedly a U.S. Army Corps engineer, wherever he went, there was somewhat suspiciously, about 6 months later, a coup, and the government fell. So as a young girl, I figured that both my father and my grandfather were spies, and that becoming one, joining the CIA, would be something of a birthright for me. And even after I grew out of Harriet, I did not grow out of my childhood dream and ambition. Years later, in 1994, I would apply to the CIA. And when I say apply, I mean I typed up a letter, folded it in thirds, put it in a white envelope, and wrote Central Intelligence Agency, Langley, Virginia, put a stamp on it, and put it in the mail. The only people I told were my brother, my mother, and my father. My father told me the CIA would never take me. He said, "Well, if they want you, they'll find you." He said, "You're too liberal. You should have been president of the Young Republicans Club." He said, "You've smoked pot." Well, I was the kind of girl, I am the kind of woman, when someone tells me I can't do something, especially a man, I'm going to do it. So, partly to prove my dad wrong, and I should add here that by that time, I had realized he never really worked for the agency. He really did just design ships for the U.S. Navy. I did apply to the CIA, and well, after many interviews, batteries of aptitude tests, drug tests, which I passed, a polygraph, which I passed, after being declared a sexual deviant, but that's a story for another. That's a story in my book. You got to get the book to read that one. A nearly year-long background investigation, I was accepted into the CIA's clandestine service. And so I traveled to Langley, Virginia to start my dream job. That's the seal of the CIA, and that's me. I don't know how old I was there, maybe like 28, in disguise, smoking a cigarette. Even my mom didn't recognize me in that disguise. CIA training at Camp Perry, otherwise known as the Farm, was a blast, literally. We learned how to assemble and dismantle explosives. We did land navigation, where they dropped us into the woods with nothing but a contour map and an MRE, and we had to find our way to out to a certain place at a certain time. We raced speedboats around the Chesapeake Bay. We learned to fire every imaginable kind of weapon. We had a defensive driving course on an actual speedway that was called Crash and Burn, and we actually crashed cars through barriers. I got the most improved award in that part of the training. And we endured a faux POW camp experience where we were captured and made to withstand harsh interrogation and a certain amount of physical and psychological intimidation. We jumped out of airplanes. I think I've got a picture for that. That's me after I became airborne qualified after 6 jumps out of a plane. I'm going to pause for a minute here to tell one of my favorite CIA stories that I didn't really include, but I want to tell it. So we had training, obviously, before we jumped out of the planes, and they told us there were different kind of misfortunes that could happen. There were 4 of them, the worst of which was if your parachute didn't open. That was the one I dreaded the most. But there were others that were more likely, and they were a water, wire, or tree landing. So you could either land in the water, in the Chesapeake Bay or the York River, land on a wire, an electrical wire, or land in a tree. And there were different things that you were supposed to do if this happened. But I was very worried about any of these outcomes, and luckily none of them befell me. But there was a woman in our class who did land in a tree, very high up in a tree, and she became stuck there. And she was there for quite a while. And while she was there, the agency instructors were kind of scrambling, trying to figure out how we're going to get her out of the tree. And they finally told the rest of us trainees that we should all go back to our barracks and we should come back with our mattresses. And our mattresses were those thin, black and white striped kind of prison mattresses. So we did. We all went back to the bunks and came back with the mattresses, and we stacked them up like in a pyramid below this tree, and she's still kind of hanging there. And then they told us to get a parachute, and we would spread that out over the mattresses. So anyway, what happened was one of the instructors, an old Vietnam vet paramilitary guy, I think I call him Wolf in my book, but that's not his real name. He had a different code name. He ended up shimmying up the tree and saving her. But she told me later when she got down that she was up there in the tree looking down at this pyramid of mattresses, this makeshift trampoline, and she thought to herself, this is the Central Intelligence Agency, and this is the best that they can do. So, in addition to paramilitary operations training, none of which, by the way, would have any bearing on our future careers as operatives, we also had months of what's called tradecraft training. And this is where we learned the tricks of the trade of being an undercover operative. So surveillance detection, disguises, commo plans to include signal sites, dead drops, brush passes, all of the things you might see in an old spy movie that spies really did use and use to this day. Traveling an alias, and as Sam mentioned, I'll jump forward a little bit to when I was actually deployed, and I had several alias documents and identities, and we got to choose our names and where we were from. And so my first alias identity, I chose her to be from Lander, Wyoming, because I had spent time in Wyoming, in the Wind River Range, one of my favorite places in the world, and also working at the gift shop at Old Faithful when I was in college. This is, I Actually, these are pictures from a Knowles wilderness survival course that I did in 1990, and that was, I think, the first time that I came to Wyoming and where I first discovered my God. Love this place. I also, and I wasn't going to tell this story either, but I also did a multi-day hike in the Tetons when I was about 21 years old with a boyfriend, and a long-term boyfriend. And we were hiking and camping for, I think it was like 4 nights and 5 days in the Tetons. And I think it was either the first night or the second. I mean, we were deep into it, so maybe it was the second night that he broke down and revealed that he'd cheated on me. And I was stuck in the Tetons and had 4 days to hike and camp out with this jackass. So, you know, come to think of it, maybe that was my first rodeo with adversity, but I got through that. Anyway, we were trained and tested extensively at living and defending our cover stories. And most importantly, we were trained on how to spot, assess, develop, and recruit foreign agents. So one question I'm always asked about my time at the CIA is, did you ever fear for your life? And the truth is, I never feared for my own life. I feared only for the lives and the well-being of the foreign agents I had recruited and/or I was handling, because those are the people who are really taking the greatest risks, doing something that neither you nor I would ever do, which is to commit espionage. And they're doing this 9 times out of 10 against their own self-interests, sometimes out of a sense of purpose or ideology, but more often than not for money, or maybe a sense of validation or even desperation. So I immediately began to see that being a CIA officer was not all it was cracked up to be. It wasn't really scaling walls in a black cat suit and breaking into safes. It was more manipulating people and preying upon their vulnerabilities and weaknesses and using them. But that's the business of human intelligence. But I was also starting to see that maybe the CIA wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. In any event, after I finished my training, I was sent to the Balkans, where I had some language skills and where, this was pre-September 11th, the US and the CIA had a vested interest in what was going on, particularly in former Yugoslavia, which was just emerging from years of violent, bitter interethnic wars. I think I have another picture. That's kind of all the different countries of what was former Yugoslavia and the Balkans now, or their flags. The bloodshed and atrocities committed throughout former Yugoslavia, and particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, shocked the world. It had shocked me. This was where I first understood how mass rape is used as a tool of psychological and physical warfare. This was where I first understood how quickly a seemingly civilized country can fall apart and devolve into unthinkable violence and hatred. A scenario that would haunt me years later and haunted me in 2021 as I watched the events of January 6th unfold in Washington, D.C., where I live, and that haunt me to this day. In 1984, the beautiful, historically and culturally rich city of Sarajevo had hosted the Winter Olympics. By 1994, it was best known for hosting Sniper Alley, which during the Bosnian War was lined with Serbian snipers' posts and became infamous as a deadly place for civilians to traverse. Those wars left economic, political, and psychological damage in the region that is still felt decades later. Fast forward to when I was stationed in Skopje, Macedonia, which was one of the countries of former Yugoslavia. And one of the priorities of the CIA was to hunt down Serbian war criminals like Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, both of whom were accused of genocide and crimes against humanity for the killing of thousands of Muslim civilians at Srebrenica and Sarajevo. These were the worst atrocities that Europe had seen since the Nazi era. Stationed in Skopje on the cusp of the new millennium, and I should add here that during the years that I was in Macedonia, this tiny, once peaceful country, it seemed like it was going to be the only country of Yugoslavia not to devolve into civil war. It was teetering on the edge of civil war. The US embassy was attacked twice while I was there, resulting in 100 Marines being stationed to the embassy. They slept on floors in the tiny building 24/7. There were roadblocks everywhere. The mountains where I had hoped and planned to ski and to rock climb were taken over by rebel groups, and so those were off limits, not just to me, but to everyone. And I would fall asleep to the sound of shelling every night. Word had spread through the region that the CIA was paying for information on the whereabouts of Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic and other war criminals. In the socioeconomically depressed region around Skopje and Pristina in Kosovo, which was quite close, this resulted in me spending a lot of time in parked cars with fat, chain-smoking, old Serbian men who were sure they knew where the war criminals were. And they would tell me for a price. But first I would have to listen to their take on the war and what they felt was the cradle of Slavic civilization, and blah, blah, blah. None of these old-timers ever had an inkling where Mladic or Karadzic might be. But that's the way that human intelligence works. You gotta hear them out anyway, and you gotta pay them. In some ways, you almost have to admire their chutzpah and the enterprising nature in full-on playing American spies like me and the mighty US government. It would be years later, but both Karadzic and Mladic were eventually captured, and they were both tried at the International War Crimes Tribunal. So let me talk for a moment about the particular benefits and challenges of being a female operative. I chose to focus on the former Soviet states and Eastern Europe, specifically because they provided the perfect balance of those benefits and challenges for a woman operating undercover. Unlike the Middle East, where in many places women must remain veiled or wear the hijab, and where they are certainly not afforded a place at the table of decision makers or access to possible targets, and where it would have been frankly absurd for me to think I could be out on the streets day and night, spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, and handling foreign agents, the Eastern Bloc was not so sexist that I could not operate effectively, very effectively. But it was sexist enough that nobody ever suspected that I was a spy. These are some Hollywood depictions of spies. Nobody at the CIA looks like that or dresses like that. The CIA is a place of sensible shoes, I will tell you that right now. Years later, before I wrote and published my book, I wrote an article for Washingtonian magazine entitled "Why Women Make Better Spies." I stand by that thesis to this day. I have always maintained that the CIA's best kept secret is that its best officers are women. I'll tell you a little bit about what I think some of the benefits or advantages of being a female operative are. Number one, it's easy to get targets, most of whom are men throughout the world, that's just a fact, to agree to meet us for coffee or lunch. They almost always say yes. It's super easy to play upon the vulnerabilities and motivations of these men, and I am not talking about sex. The CIA does not deploy its female officers as honeypots, contrary to Hollywood depictions and generally assumed myths. But it is so easy to flatter these men, to stroke their egos, and to play the sympathetic and listening ear, to say things like, "I'm so sorry your boss doesn't appreciate what you have to say because I find it fascinating. And you know, I shared what you told me through very secret, secure channels back to Washington, and Washington policymakers are really interested in what you have to say. And even the President of the United States has been briefed about it. That works. I've said that a number of times. Another obvious advantage, you have a built-in cover story. God forbid, when and if you're ever apprehended in a parked car or a hotel room with a foreign official or a man by the security services or the police or the bellhop, whatever, you have a cover story. We're having an affair. And the last thing is, men will talk to women. As female CIA officers, we became their confidants, their psychologists, their links to a sense of purpose and appreciation and self-worth, and also to their incomes. I would not realize until years later, when I had children, how much a maternal instinct also plays a role as a CIA operative. And while I'm on the topic of children, let me just say that when my boys were babies and toddlers, and even a little bit to this day, I viewed them very much as like recalcitrant foreign agents who, despite my best efforts and very honed powers of manipulation, often did and do the exact opposite of what they were told or what I wanted. Another way in which they resembled foreign agents to me, I worried about them all the time, and I still do. And it was up to me to keep them alive when they were babies and safe. And this is very much true when you're handling a foreign agent. So what are the challenges of being a female operative? Well, since you're largely targeting men, playing upon their egos, acting interested and appreciative of everything they have to say, but over time also telling them that they can't tell anyone else about your relationship, and moving your meeting places to more and more discreet and clandestine venues like parked cars and hotels, inevitably they get the wrong idea. And I don't know any female CIA operatives who have not had to deal with the issue of male sources and agents thinking they're going to have sex or pursuing that. So I'm going to tell you a little story about the first guy that I recruited. He was an Albanian businessman. I call him Ahmed in my book. And during the development stage, where you're developing this friendship and relationship with the source, but you're not really, you're not letting on that you work for the CIA, I would take him to pizza places on the edge of town because I didn't really want people to see us together, but I knew that this was a promising target, and he would cut up my pizza for me and even try to feed me. And I established very early on, I'm a diplomat, these are business meetings, I'm interested in your thoughts on the region and what's going to happen with the war. But he would just not, get it in his head that I was not romantically interested in him. And so I accelerated the development and the recruitment process because I really wanted to get to that point where you break cover, where you tell the person, hey, I actually work for the CIA, okay? And this is going to be a business relationship. I'm going to pay you money, you're going to give me information. And that's the way it is. So I worked hard to get to that point with Ahmed, and I was nervous about telling him that I worked for the CIA, even though you're dropping a lot of hints along the way that if someone doesn't get it by the time you get to the pitch, I don't know, you might not want them working for you anyway. And we had extensive training on what to do if someone reacts badly when you break cover and you pitch them, what if they say they're going to report you or go to the security services, and there are safeguards to make sure there's not that kind of blowback, so that by the time you do break cover or you pitch them, you should be pretty sure that they're going to say yes. But you never know, and we trained for this at the farm. So anyway, when I finally told Ahmed that I worked for the CIA, he said, I love the CIA. And so that was a relief, and I was able to recruit him. But even after recruiting him, he did not stop being problematic. And finally, I said to him, we are never going to have sex. That is never going to happen. So you have to get that out of your mind. And he said to me, can we at least hold hands? And I'm like, no, we cannot hold hands. And the other thing with these sources, they're very difficult to handle, is that you have to train them in watching out for their own security. So you have to give them some rudimentary training in surveillance detection and how to communicate without using cell phones. And so you have a communications plan so that you never have to be on the cell phone together. So I would tell Ahmed when I was going to pick him up for a meeting, this was after he was recruited, I'm going to drive up to the alley where I told you to be. You're going to be there. When my car drives up, when you see the safety signal, I'm going to push open the door, you hop in the car, and then we're going to drive away and we'll conduct the meeting while I'm driving, or we'll park somewhere and we'll conduct the meeting. And I said, and don't bring your cell phone to the meetings, and don't call me on my cell phone. And inevitably, I'd be on my way to a meeting and my cell phone would ring and I'd answer, and he would say, Lisa, he knew me by the name of Lisa, Lisa, I am on my way to the secret place. One time he had flowers for me. He was supposed to just come out of the alley and get in the car, and he comes out and he had like a bouquet of roses, and he was, waving it like he was guiding an airplane in. He was a mess. But he was a good agent. He was a good source. Anyway, a few things happened while I was in Macedonia to further some mounting disillusionment with my career and make me really question the worth of the CIA, not least of which was September 11th. And we all have our where were we story about that day, and I'm gonna spare you my where I was story, except to say that I was in Macedonia, and that while the events of 9/11 were devastating for the country as a whole, I think they were particularly devastating and particularly wrenching for those of us working for the CIA, because no matter how you cut it, that was the biggest intelligence failure of our time. And we were precisely the organization that was supposed to prevent something like that from happening. I'm going to pivot here and talk about one disturbing crime against humanity I witnessed firsthand in the Balkans that I completely lacked the power to do anything about, and that the CIA was not the least bit interested in, and that is human trafficking. As I mentioned earlier, throughout the 1990s, former Yugoslavia had been ravaged by civil war and ethnic cleansing, the devastating ripple effects of which would carry on and do to this day. Neighboring countries like Albania and Bulgaria had also not recovered economically or psychologically from decades of brutal totalitarian regimes. Poverty was rampant and economic opportunity was scarce. And one of the collateral effects of this was an extraordinary uptick in women and girls being trafficked, either into forced prostitution within their own countries or elsewhere, into Western Europe, Canada, the Middle East, and yes, the United States of America. Some girls, particularly Roma, were trafficked using forced marriage for the purpose of involuntary domestic servitude. Many Roma boys and girls were and are also subjected to forced begging by organized groups. Adult men and women were and are recruited for slave labor. Traffickers often use intermediaries or middlemen to bring clients to motels, gas stations, or apartments where victims are held against their will and sold as sex slaves, often multiple times a day or night. And unlike drugs, human beings as a commodity can be sold again and again. Traffickers abscond with their victims' passports and documentation. They destroy lives, and they do it largely in plain sight and oftentimes unabated. So the Balkans was the first place and the first time that I saw modern slavery, and yes, it is slavery, up close and in person. But this is not the only place it exists. It also happens today, and it happens here, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. But back to the Balkans. I need to say that I was aware, many of us were aware, that some of the brothels and strip clubs frequented by US servicemen, contractors, and government officials were known to hold trafficked women and girls. I and some other women, some from the State Department, brought this up at meetings and internally with our respective organizations, and our concerns fell largely on deaf ears. In the case of the CIA, human trafficking is simply not in its purview. The agency is in the business of collecting intelligence that informs and impacts US national security. On paper and in theory, we fight bad guys. But the reality is much more nuanced and complex. We don't really fight bad guys, we collect information about them, and only a certain kind of bad guy. And let's be honest, a lot of bad guys end up on our CIA payroll, on your taxpayer-funded payroll, because money, not waterboarding, is generally what gets people to talk and to share sensitive and secret information. I want to be clear, I'm not blaming the CIA for failing women and girls, and boys and men too, around the globe in not protecting them from being trafficked. It's just simply not in the intelligence directives to do so. There are no intelligence requirements the agency has to fulfill with respect to human trafficking. It's just not their problem, their issue. So what I saw and what I heard, in some cases girls as young as 12 and 13 being trafficked into sex slavery, was of no interest to headquarters. And especially not in the wake of September 11th, 2001, when the intention of the entire intelligence community, with the CIA at the lead, turned to the war on terror, ridding Afghanistan of the Taliban. That worked out well. Hunting and rooting out terrorists and finding Osama bin Laden. The Balkans was not just a hub for human traffickers, it was also both a transit route and a rich target pool and recruiting opportunity for terrorist networks and groups. So before I left the region, I too shifted my focus to finding possible informants to befriend and to recruit within those networks. When I returned to the US from overseas, I was sent to full-time Russian language training for a follow-on tour. But then all of a sudden, there was talk of invading Iraq. I was not an expert in this area of the world or on the topic of counterproliferation, but I was baffled as the idea about waging war in Iraq started to gain traction at the agency and in the public. At CIA, I was taken out of language lessons and I was surged into Iraqi operations. And here my confusion and disillusionment only increased. Every day I was reading in the Washington Post about how we had evidence of WMD and there was a link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And then I would get into headquarters and I would speak to the analysts and operators and folks sent over from the NSA who were really experts in this area, and they would all tell me that that was not the case. It was at this time that I decided to leave the CIA. In my book, I cite the Iraq War as the straw that broke the camel's back. But it was actually something else, something that I could not write about in the book because I had to have my book cleared by the CIA, and they never would have cleared this. But that I did write about years later in a 2014 Politico article entitled "The CIA Book I Wish I Had Written." And that discussed the CIA torture program and the real reason I felt I had to get out. Since leaving the CIA, I became a mother. And I believe I have evolved from wanting to serve my country and a profound sense of pride and patriotism about being a US citizen to aspiring to serve humanity as best I can and to being a better global citizen. Purpose and passion have always been core to my personal and professional life, and moving to nonprofit communications, strategy, development, and advocacy has been a natural trajectory for me. Today, as Sam mentioned, I serve on the board of India Water Project, a nonprofit committed to easing the burden on women and girls throughout underserved communities of India by providing clean, safe, and easily accessible sources of water. I have also redirected my efforts to the unfathomable crime and indignity I saw for the first time and firsthand in the Balkans, and that is the issue of human trafficking and global slavery. It may come as a shock to many, as it did to me, that human trafficking happens here in our own backyards. The chances of an American kid being killed in a terrorist attack are infinitesimally small, and yet we effectively threw and continue to throw the full force of our military and intelligence capabilities toward fighting, some may say winning, some may not, the war on terror. Shockingly, there is no entity or centralized task force at the federal level to attack and eradicate human trafficking. So, I found a place that does just that. Deliver Fund is not a federal agency or a joint task force, but it operates much the way the alphabet soup organizations like the CIA and NSA did in ferreting out and tracking suspected terrorists. It employs former agency analysts, operators, and targeters to replicate the paradigm we used to fight the war on terror after 9/11. How can slavery occur here in the United States, you might ask? Let's start by defining and looking at the problem. The internet and social media have enabled human trafficking, and especially sex trafficking and the commercial exploitation of children, to proliferate exponentially. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children saw an 846%, let that sink in, increase in suspected child trafficking in only 5 years. Deliver Fund correlates that increase with the mass adoption of the smartphone. Dollar to dollar, human trafficking in the US is worse than what I saw overseas. It's a market in the US that has grown exponentially, and it's not what most people think. Just like Hollywood gets the CIA and the business of spying completely wrong, it also glamorizes and misrepresents the human trafficking issue, suggesting that pretty American girls are abducted and taken to the Middle East, and their Liam Neeson-esque daddies wage personal and successful crusades to save them. In fact, human trafficking in the US primarily consists of American women and children being sold to American men, and sometimes women, in American cities and rural America. Human trafficking is indeed a very American problem. American human trafficking is also a volume-based business, and to conduct business in volume, human traffickers must advertise at scale. The only way to do this in the modern era is on the internet. So that is precisely where the human trafficking problem needs to be fought. This was kind of a eureka moment for Nick McKinley, who's a former CIA special agent and the founder of Deliver Fund, the nonprofit organization that fights human trafficking in a way that no other organization or agency does, and the organization behind which I decided to throw the weight of my energy and my life's experience. Nick had seen how data analytics had disrupted the terrorism market and changed the war on terror. And so he formed this thesis that that would work in the human trafficking fight. And he assembled a crackerjack team to fight this cause. And around the premise that if the internet is the problem, then the internet must be the primary focus of the solution. In the modern fight against trafficking, there is not a lack of data. In fact, there is more data available than you could ever use. The problem for law enforcement is finding data relevant to their cases and identifying where that data intersects with other cases. In fighting terrorism overseas, we realized pretty quickly that we were not going to kill our way out of the problem. We needed an approach that disrupted the market as a whole. If you kill one terrorist with a drone, you don't eliminate the problem. And what's more, you likely create 100 or maybe 1,000 more terrorists or terrorist sympathizers by ignoring the so-called collateral damage of civilian deaths. Human trafficking, the world of human trafficking, is a loose affiliation of like minds. And traffickers actually collaborate and work together to sell children and victims among one another. So if we can attack the points of transaction in the market, we can make it difficult and risky for these bad guys to find each other and to do business together. To further the terrorism analogy just a little bit more, the act of arresting a terrorist eliminates that terrorist, but mapping the points of transaction in the terrorism market and attacking those prevents future terrorism. So attacking transactions is a strategy that Deliver Fund uses in the fight against human trafficking. So far, the results have been greater than we could ever imagine. We've seen hundreds of victims rescued and dozens of traffickers brought to justice. We currently have a 100% conviction rate on the cases in which we've been involved that have gone to court. We host the largest human-derived human trafficking database in existence and use that platform to connect law enforcement officers across the US at the federal, state, and local levels. When a human trafficking investigator in Atlanta has a case that intersects with an active case in, say, Phoenix, the investigators are informed of the connection between those two cases, and they can collaborate in real time. And in this way, they can reduce the cost and increase the probability of conviction. That is the power of data in the fight against human trafficking. I am at my core, however, a people person, not a techie or a data nerd. That's why I got into human intelligence to begin with and joined the CIA, not the NSA. Although I physically left the agency, a part of my psyche is forever tied to it. The sense of mission, the need to serve a purpose greater than myself, and the drive to convince other people to help in that crusade. Nor have the training or tactics I honed at the agency gone to waste. I use those skills today to raise money for and awareness about the scourge of modern slavery. I have realized over time and again that you can take the girl out of the CIA, but you can never take the CIA out of the girl. Perhaps the most gratifying part of doing development work on behalf of Deliver Fund is not talking about our incredible data-driven and data-enabled results, but rather about the human impact we as an organization have, the difference we make in people's lives on levels both big and small. And more than that, it's been the extraordinary men, and even more so, the women who work on this cause. Women like Sandy Storm, on the left, our Director of Strategic Impact, and a sex trafficking survivor herself. Sandy draws from her personal experience as a trusted advisor for law enforcement, medical and educational, professional service providers, and concerned citizens. She also leads Deliver Fund Thrivers Department, made up of other survivors. Sandy is, simply put, one of the most extraordinary women I've ever met in my life, and the consummate example of not just overcoming what many might see as insurmountable adversity, but turning adversity on its head to serve a higher cause. Women also like Deliver Fund's Chief of Analytics, Kara Smith, on the right, also known as Kara the Huntress. Kara began her career as an intelligence analyst supporting critical missions spearheaded by the National Security Agency. Kara not only brings her unique analytical capabilities and experience in combating counterterrorism to directly inform Deliver Fund's counter-human trafficking methodology, she brings irrepressible energy and passion to the fight. Small in stature and a single mom, when I think of Kara, a quote from Shakespeare comes to mind. And though she be but little, she is fierce. Simply put, she is a force of nature that human traffickers should and do fear. I am in awe of women like Sandy and Kara, and I could go on about others and survivors and thrivers I've joined in the fight against human trafficking. But I want to bring us full circle here and finally address the title of my talk, Back in the Saddle, Making Adversity Work for You, which I am suddenly realizing could have caused some folks to roll their eyes, so sorry about that. Making adversity work for you. But to return full circle, I have to return to the scene of the crime, or rather, the scene of the accident and breaking my neck. When I left, and by left I mean walked out of the emergency ward on June 2nd, 2002, albeit slowly and gingerly, and with the aid of my older son, and wearing a neck brace that I would not take off except to switch out with a waterproof one for showers, for months to come, I was a changed woman. Where I had always thought that I'd led an inexplicably and undeservedly blessed life, at this moment, right now, tonight, I honestly do not think I was really blessed until that moment when I got in a bad accident and broke my neck. In 1 second, the second of impact, my life was irrevocably changed for the better. For the next several weeks and months, I was in a certain amount of pain and discomfort. And I, of course, could not do many of the things that I was accustomed to doing: biking, swimming, driving, lifting anything, not even walking my dogs. What I could do, what I had to do, in fact, was to be present, to slow the F down for the first time in my life, and to sit still. And so that's what I did. Thanks to modern technology, I did some work that I could do for some clients. I interfaced weekly with Randa Shahab, head of India Water Project, and other board members, and they all cut me slack and gave me time to heal. I spoke daily and met at least once a week via Zoom with other folks at Deliver Fund, and I continued to do what outreach and writing I could for the organization and contribute to the fight against human trafficking. For the first time in 2 decades, I actually started in earnest to write another book. I spent a lot of wonderful time with my 2 amazing sons, who helped in ways beyond just taking out the trash, like when an ending lease forced me to find a new place to live, they helped me pack up and actually move their and my life's belongings in July, still with a broken neck. I was finally able to appear on Marcus Aurelius's podcast and talk about the gift of adversity, because God had indeed given me that gift. Truly, there was no time to feel sorry for myself, because I was constantly reminded of how lucky I was. I was reminded directly by countless medical professionals who told me again and again that in spite of the severity of my injury and some complications that were preventing me from healing properly, I was lucky to be alive and not paralyzed. And I was reminded indirectly of how lucky I was by the extraordinary community of support that emerged for me, sending care packages and driving me places and cooking meals and walking my dogs. But also just so many people sending words of encouragement, and for those that believe in the power of prayer, keeping me in their prayers. 2 months ago, almost to this day, I was in the pre-op room at Suburban Hospital about to have surgery on my neck. When I say about to have surgery, I mean literally about to have it. I was in the gown with the cloth shower cap on. I already had an IV needle in my arm, and I was just waiting to be wheeled into the operating theater. My brother was with me, and he had started a group text thread among some close friends and family. The surgery I was to have was laminectomy, spine, cervical, posterior approach, which meant they were going to go through the back of my neck, with fusion using instrumentation. And I had been told both by my surgeon and several other medical professionals that it was complex and risky. My guy even used the words bloody several times, and morbid. But as I mentioned earlier, there were some complications at root preventing me from healing, and my doctor and I had put off surgery as long as possible until it seemed like the last and a necessary resort. So there I was, waiting to go under the knife when my doctor, I'm going to pull up a picture of him, Dr. Hamid Hassanzada. I owe this guy my firstborn, by the way. And I'm thinking of delivering on that just in time for my firstborn to go to college, and he can pay for it. Dr. H came into the room, and he pulled up some last-minute CAT scan images he had ordered just that morning. He'd ordered these images in order to be able to see precisely where the delicate blood vessels surrounding my broken C1 were before he operated. As soon as Dr. H had the images up, he said, "Wow, you are healing." He pointed out to me where one side of the C1 had, in the 3 weeks since my last CAT scan, regenerated enough bone to be partially fused. This is what I call God's fusion, Dr. H said. He looked at me and then at my brother, and he said, "I will not perform this surgery. You're healing on your own. It is not worth the risk." We were pretty stunned. My brother, Scott, a Navy pilot, sent out a group text. "Everybody can stand down. Surgery is off." Our multi-denominational group text had already been praying to different gods on my behalf. There were Ganesh memes, the Virgin of Guadalupe candles had been lit. My little Jewish mother went to Friday services and had asked that my name be added to the blessings. I knew that people like Sandy Storm at Deliver Fund, whose strength is deeply rooted in her Christian faith, were praying for me too. And you know what? Those prayers worked. I walked out of the hospital that day without a brace. Yes, my neck was still sore as hell. It still is today. Not too sore, it's getting better. And I may never get full range of motion back in my neck, but that's okay. It's not like I was going to be an Olympic figure skater. And truth be told, I have done probably enough rock climbing and skydiving and horseback riding in my life. I am, however, back in the saddle. Perhaps not literally, but at least figuratively, and that is why I am here today. The adversity that I experienced was but a wrinkle in time, and I am tremendously grateful for that, but not nearly as grateful as I am for having had to experience it in the first place. Having purpose, as I think I do, and opting to feel gratitude enabled me to get back in the saddle and to make adversity work for me. I want to close by offering a tenet of my own homespun philosophy, or if you want to call it religion. I believe that our lives are made meaningful by the ways in which we touch the lives of other people. Some of us, perhaps many people in this room, have been bestowed with privileges that enable us to touch the lives of many others, or even on a grand scale. Others may face such hardship or scarcity or adversity that they cannot afford to give as much of their resources or their times or themselves. But every act, every gesture toward making the world a better, more peaceful, less violent, more loving, and understanding place counts. Each of our decisions counts. Each of our decisions has ripple effects, both good and bad, countless ripple effects that can be felt across the globe and by our children and for generations to come. My last pick. These are all pictures, paintings or drawings done by my mother, who she discovered she was an artist when she was well into her 60s. So it is my belief that not only do women make better spies, they generally make better decisions. Yeah. Just by way of one example, women don't drive around lost for hours on end because they are afraid to ask for directions. It is my belief that we should have more women in intelligence, national security, in public policy, and in the presidency. It is my belief that by harnessing the energy and the empathy and the sheer grit and endurance of womankind, we can not only overcome any adversity, but we can make it work for us, and we can make it work for the world around us. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? I went on and on. So we might not have time for too many questions, but I'll be here tomorrow. 2 questions? 2 questions. And before people leave, you wanted me to get a selfie with everyone behind. All right, just before you leave, let me just I'm a selfie person, so.
Okay, well, while they're assembling, I'm just going to say a couple words because I know some people are already sort of getting ready to sneak out.
Okay.
Oh.
Do we have time for any questions?
Do we have a couple questions?
Anyone?
Oh, yes. Megan.
What's the average day in the life of a CIA agent look like?
It can be really boring, to be honest. But it is a stressful, in spite of what my son said, it's a very stressful job because generally you have a cover job too. So you might be doing your cover job during the day and working the entire day doing your cover job. I was lucky enough that I didn't have a lot of cover duties, but then you're out at night casing spots where you're gonna pick up people like Ahmed. Anytime you do something operational, like just going to pick up Ahmed for one operational meeting, for at least 2 hours before that, I'm driving around doing what's called a surveillance detection route, making sure that nobody's following me, because if I drag surveillance to my meeting site with Ahmed, then we both get wrapped up. So you spend a lot of time driving around. After the meeting, you have to do a reverse surveillance detection route, and then you got to go write everything up, because everything that happens operationally, every little facet of that source that you're developing or that case that you're running has to be documented for headquarters, because something could happen to me or I'm going to leave the country and Ahmed's going to be passed on to another CIA operative. So there was an adage there, if you don't write it, it didn't happen. So there's an extraordinary amount of paperwork involved. Yeah.
If you were to give one, just like a sentence of advice to women who consistently face the adversity that faces us in the workplace and life and society, knowing that you stepped up to the plate to make a change and do what was right, what would you say to them?
Oh, that's tough. I think the thing that has served me well throughout my entire career is the subtle art of not giving an F. When you're faced with someone who's just a jerk or who's going to denigrate you, silence is very powerful. So even though your inclination might be to speak up and you feel like I have to speak up in order to stand up for myself, sometimes it's better just to be silent and let that person make an ass out of themselves. Because when someone is a jerk to you in a professional setting, in a personal setting, other people see that. And it always says more about that person than it does about you. So one thing I've learned over time is you cannot control the actions of others. You can only control how you react and how you handle it. So just, keep calm and carry on. Okay, thank you.
Lindsay, thank you so much. I don't think that we could ask for a better example of true moxie as Lindsay. And as you all know, this is just the start to our whole summit. I do want to share that when Lindsay and I started corresponding, she did not have a neck injury. That happened over the course of our correspondence since last spring. But I also feel really that it's essential to introduce Melissa Cassett, who is Womentum's second official employee. She's our director of communications. She is our connection to Lindsay. She helped make it that first introduction to bring her here, and we're so grateful for that. And I just want to say that actually this is how Womentum's programming happens, is a room full of extraordinary people, no more extraordinary people, and the dots connect and we get to bring them to this community. So anyone who ever has suggestions, we welcome them always. And so Many of you are attending tomorrow. We're so excited to see you again tomorrow. Those of you in this room, those who are watching remotely, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. The doors at the Center for the Arts open at 8:30. The presentation with Bonnie Wan begins at 9:30. For those of you who are staying for the full day, Lindsay will be doing a brief talk for a half an hour at the middle of the day, and so we're looking forward to that. Those of you at home, please remember it's a different link for live streaming tomorrow. So make sure you check your email either from us directly or through Eventbrite. And with that, I want to thank Jackson Hole Book Trader, who has books available. Lindsay will be available for signing, and we hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming.